And now it's time for a panel discussion titled How Libraries and Consortia Can Support the OA Transitions of Not-for-Profit Publishers and Why. Alicia Wise, panel moderator, will introduce her panelists. Mrs. Wise, welcome and please start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alicia Wise, and I'm really delighted to moderate a panel discussion. We have three terrific panelists. We have Colleen Campbell from the Max Planck Digital Library, David Prosser from Research Libraries UK, and Claire Moulton from the Company of Biologists. And we're going to be talking to you all and with you all as you ask questions through the chat about the ways libraries and consortia can support the open access transitions of smaller independent publishers and why you might want to do so. The context for today's discussion is that, if I can advance my slide, which I can't. There we go, is that very recently a report was published on behalf of Coalition S that was focused on exactly this topic. So the URL for the report is at the bottom of the screen. It's not the most friendly URL, but you are free to look at the report in your free time if you would like to do so. And the reason Coalition S commissioned this work was to really look at the impact of transformative and other sorts of open access agreements and their availability for smaller independent publishers to participate in over the last 18 months or so. So what do we mean by open access agreements during today's discussion? There are all flavors of open access agreements. So you might have heard of publish and read agreements, or PAR agreements, they're sometimes known as, read and publish agreements, read, publish, and join, or names such as subscribe to open or pure publishing agreements. What these all have in common is that they're agreements between a library or a consortium and a publisher, and they cover both read access to any content behind a paywall, but also the ability for researchers in your university or research institution to be able to publish open access with that publisher. So both the read and the publish activities are covered under one contract. And what do we mean by smaller independent publishers? There are an array of these. Sometimes they can be learned societies who publish independently without a larger publishing partner. But we can also include university presses in this bucket and library presses too. So some of you will be publishers as well as librarians, and independent commercial presses too, many of which are very small and important, for example, in book publishing in the humanities. So as we discuss today, think about a broad array of different types of open access agreements with smaller independent publishers of various kinds. Now, the report made some key recommendations because we discovered while we were doing the research for it that there are three categories of real challenges that smaller independent publishers face when they're trying to enter into open access agreements with libraries and consortia. The first category of challenges are around financial issues. And here I mean that smaller independent publishers can be the last or lower priority partners for library collection development staff members or for consortia. So raising awareness that they are having and bringing forward very innovative and positive open access agreements is important to help them rise up the priority list. We also discovered that there are a number of challenges for these smaller publishers in handling any kind of individual APC payments because the infrastructure needed for individual article level open access payments can be quite great. So some of our recommendations are for funders and university leaders. We recommend that wherever possible, rather than aggregating open access money out through many grants to individual researchers, that money should be gathered and centrally administered through universities and university libraries where possible, so that there can be a central negotiation covering article publication for many researchers. There are other scalar challenges as well, because it's very daunting for a tiny publisher to deal with thousands of libraries and consortia. And equally, it can be very challenging for a consortium with very few members of staff to think about how they will cope with entering into agreements with literally thousands of smaller independent publishers. So we've got some recommendations there. And there are data and workflow challenges for everyone. These agreements are new. There are very many different flavors and kinds of agreements. And for smaller publishers in particular, and many libraries and consortia, these are being administered by hand. They're being administered manually. So some standards, some systems, and some tools to help automate some of the data exchange and tracking that's necessary would be really helpful. Finally, the report recommended the creation of a cross-stakeholder coalition to drive all of the work needed to overcome these challenges forward. And I was really thrilled to see last week a statement signed by ALPSP, by Coalition S, by the Consortium for Research Libraries, by ESAC, by JISC, by Lyrasis, and by OA 2020, making just that commitment to one another and to smaller independent publishers. So without further ado, let me hand over to Colleen Campbell from the Max Planck Digital Library. Colleen was one of the members of the steering group for this project, and she is also, on behalf of ESAC and OA 2020, one of the signatories to this statement. So Colleen, over to you.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here to raise awareness around this big, what do we call it, issue, challenge that we all have in thinking about the open access transition. Just to plant some seeds to feed the panel discussion later on and perhaps prompt questions from the participants in the session today, I thought I'd just focus on this statement that we made together with multiple groups that Alicia just mentioned, and tease out a few themes that that are in this statement. The first theme here is presented in the first sentence of the statement on enabling smaller independent publishers to participate in open access transformative arrangements. The first sentence reads, "The ongoing transition of scholarly publishing to full and immediate open access is a process that requires all stakeholders to adapt." And so this concept of adapting, right? When I was listening to Alicia just now presenting the challenges that were uncovered in her work with the scholarly publishers, I had to smile because those challenges are actually the same challenges that libraries and consortia are having, right? And so I think it is really important as we think about open access and the open access transition is to stop and recognize that we are having to adapt, all of us, all stakeholders involved, not only scholarly societies and publishers, but libraries, library consortia, institutions. It's really important that we acknowledge we are driving a system change, which means that in order to face turn this system around to face a future that is based on openness, a true open information environment, we're going to have to turn all of our processes, our workflows, our financial streams, turn them around to face that open future. And that's true of all stakeholders involved in scholarly communication. So creating that system change and adapting to an open future it requires some investment. It requires investment in personnel, in technology, in all manner of the business of providing scholarly communication services to researchers. So adaptation, we all have to adapt, and it's going to be easiest if we adapt and work together in that adaptation, which brings me to the second theme that comes out of this statement, and that is one of alignment. Alignment among research funding organizations, publishers, research performing organizations, and their research communities, and libraries and consortia. I think that for too long in the subscription system, there has been a sensation of antagonism. And as we look toward building an open future, it's important to recognize that we publishers, scholarly societies, libraries, consortia, institutions, we all have the same objectives right now in this transition. We want to transition scholarly publishing to open access for our same clientele. That clientele that we share, publishers and institutions share, are the researchers. So if we can all have that vision, that common vision of transitioning scholarly journals, the scholarly journals and services that are valued by authors, transitioning them to open access, if we share that vision, then that will help us align around how to make that transition sustainable. And I think the last theme that I wanted to mention is the concept of risk. In the statement, it talks about if we want to ensure that smaller independent publishers can make that transition, we must manage risks related to their size and scale. And I think that is a key point, this concept of risk management, but for all stakeholders. We need to share that risk for the benefit of our researchers. So it means coming together, aligning, thinking about solutions that are fair, that are reasonable, and that that evenly distribute the onus of all of the changes and the adaptations we are having to make on all of the stakeholders involved. We try to do that within the context of OA 2020 on a high level, and in the context of the ESAC initiative on the operational level. And just as a final thought, I wanted to call out how exciting it is to be one of the signatories of this statement, and to show commitment to this transition. But also mention, Alicia mentioned them as well, but ALPSP, Coalition S, ESAC, JISC, OA 2020, we are all initiatives that happen to be located in Europe. But the fact that we have library consortia like the Center for Research Libraries in the US and Lyrasis, also based in the US, I think is it's a fantastic opportunity, because this is it's a way of coming together, creating a larger network of organizations that are aligning and are wanting to work together to make this transition sustainable, also for scholarly societies, because it is extremely important to the research community that scholarly societies are able to continue their vital work. And we can talk about the publishers that with whom a lot of the library consortia in Europe have already negotiated transformative agreements, and they tend to be the larger commercial publishers. But if we want to ensure that the transition enables a truly diverse scholarly publishing environment, or scholarly communication, open scholarly communication environment, then we need to absolutely dedicate efforts to bringing scholarly societies into that conversation as well. So I'm going to stop having mentioned those few themes and turn things over now to David Prosser from RL UK.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I'm David Prosser from Research Libraries UK. One of the things that we've been doing over the last few years is we set up an open access publishers processing group, which is looking at some of the workflow issues around open access. And I'm very grateful to that group, and in particular to Catherine Sharp of UCL in the UK for some of the points I wanted to make today, because we had the discussion about some of these issues around smaller publishers. I mean, the LIBER community obviously wants to see diversity and competition within the journals market. Ideologically, we're very supportive of small independent publishers, especially those closely aligned with academia, for example, through societies. We're also very supportive ideologically of open access, and we're very keen to help with developing sustainable models for open access. Although I think many librarians would be happy with levels of sustainability lower than the current high profit levels enjoyed by some publishers, both commercial and non-commercial. But the reality, the day-to-day reality, is that the big publishers dominate and they take up a lot of time and budget. And there is often not a lot of attention or budget left over for the long tail of smaller and independent publishers. So how can we help those publishers thrive? Well, we've come up with a few ideas of what is useful for institutions and what is not useful for institutions. If publishers are thinking about what they want to do in terms of transformative deals. So let me start with some of the things that are useful. Simplicity is useful. If a proposal from a publisher is so complex, it's going to take somebody at an institution a long time to work out what exactly it means, then the danger is that they will not have that time, and so the proposal will not be looked at carefully. There needs to be consistency, both within a publisher, so how they handle different types of paper formats for letters to editors, research articles, etc., etc., etc. Some consistency across that, and also between publishers. If more small publishers come to agreements that are fundamentally the same in their structure, it is easier for an institution to say, well, that is like Model X. I know what Model X looks like for my institution. I can sign up to it. If it's different, even if it's just as different to a small extent, if it has its own idiosyncratic aspects to it, then that is friction in the system. I think more and more institutions, and especially in the UK, are looking for compliance and help with compliance with funder mandates. A proposal from a publisher that gives or helps with compliance or ensures that a paper is published with that journal is funder compliant is to be welcomed. A journal that does not help with compliance will not find favour within institutions. Institutions want predictability, both in terms of cost, so they don't want halfway through the year to suddenly find there are new costs, and in terms of workflows, they want to be able to make the workflow simple. They want transparency of pricing, and they don't want any extra charges, so they don't want to discover that as well as an APC charge, for example, there are also color figure charges or page charges. Not one of the main reasons for that is because they're funding, and again, this is certainly the case in the UK, the funding from the central funder may not cover those charges. So you can pay the APC charge, but you then have to go looking for these other costs, and that is an annoyance, and it's an extra piece of work that slows things down and takes time. If you think about what we don't want, then I guess it's the opposite of everything that I've just been discussing. Complexity is the enemy of efficiency. The more complexity that there is in any agreement, then the harder it is to make it a smooth process, and the less likely it is that the institution is going to want to take that up. Bespoke arrangements. So you may have a publisher may have a wonderful new model, but if it is so different to everything else, then the question will be asked whether or not it's something that the institution can engage with because of the attention required for that, and just the time to work it out, and the time to liaise with authors and to go back and forth, etc., etc. We don't like caps on number of papers that can be published in a given year. So a transformative deal that says that 80% of current papers can be published open access. When you get to 80%, then oops, sorry, that was my 5-minute timer to myself. which means that I'm going over time. So a cap on number of papers, and as I say, additional costs are things that we don't want to see. That very briefly is some of the areas where I think the publishers can help with us to move things forward and to help to engage with the library community. And I particularly like the recommendation that organisations such as ALPSP come together with their members to try and work with on some of that standardisation. And on that note, I will pass over to Claire from the Company of Biologists.
Okay, thank you, David. So let me share my screen. I've got a few slides to show. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about transformative agreements from the point of view of a small not-for-profit publisher. This is our small portfolio. We have the 3 journals on the top are our hybrid, now transformative journals, and the 2 on the bottom are our fully gold OA journals. We've been offering open access options since 2004, and over the past few years, originally named the Smart Ops project, we've been working with librarians and funders on transparency as well as different models for transformative routes. In 2020, our 3 hybrid journals were in fact the first in the world to be afforded transformative journal status by Plan S, and we were also one of the first not-for-profit publishers to roll out a Read and Publish initiative. So why have a transformative strategy in the first place? We do believe that open access is good for science, and we can show that our open access articles are read at least twice as much as our non-open access articles. It has been important for us to provide compliant routes, especially for Plan S funders, funded articles, and they're about 20% of our author base. And we've gone for the transformative journal strategy because the transition period retains options for authors who aren't yet ready for a compulsory open access route. So our Read and Publish agreements so far, we are covering more than 250 institutions from more than 20 countries. Our consortia agreements cover the UK, Ireland and Israel, and we've been piloting variations on our agreements with the Max Planck Digital Library and the University of California. And we were delighted to recently sign an agreement with IFL that helps us support researchers in 30 developing and transition economy countries. So the sorts of positive feedback that we've had about our arrangements are transparent, cost-neutral pricing. This is going to be a recurring theme. Our transformative journal status has also been popular, I think because it shows that in addition to being innovative, we're also taking this transition to open access seriously. We've gone for the uncapped open access publishing. As David mentioned, it's important to make a commitment that the authors from participating institutes won't reach a threshold where the rules change during the year. It gives everybody more consistency. We've also given unlimited access to the journals and all of their archives of content. We've tried to make it as easy as possible. So in most cases, librarians just need to sign a simple addendum to their existing subscription contract to move to a Read and Publish agreement. And we also have in-house automatic recognition of corresponding authors to make it easy for them. In terms of feedback from Consortia, the positive feedback has been about us being flexible and willing to experiment. Most of the consortia are focused on our 3 hybrid journals, but some have wanted to include our 2 open access journals as well. Most consortia want cost-free processes, and we've worked really hard at a pain-free process for authors, but others prefer a shared funding model, especially if authors already have alternative funding routes. As Colleen said, this is all about serving the researcher as authors and readers. We're all wanting to help them. So I'm going to show an example here of the journal in our portfolio that's had the least interest in open access over the past decade. So although it has the same APCs and the same policies as the other journals, you can see that on this journal, the percentage of research content had never got above 4%. Over 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, we're seeing the impact of Read and Publish agreements, so that this year we've reached a level of 12% open access research content, with the vast majority of those authors having taken a Read and Publish option. So I would say things that we've learned: the transformative journal status definitely works hand in hand with Read and Publish agreements. It is the Read and Publish agreements that actually increase the percentage of open access, as you can see on this slide, and that helps us to fulfill our transformative journal commitment to grow open access content. But the transformative journal also gives us a transition period where authors will be compliant with their funder mandates, and it gives us more time to roll out read and publish agreements to more institutions and more countries. We had to introduce new end-to-end processes and workflows, and in a small organisation like ours, that has involved almost everybody. We've also got lots of time-consuming manual work behind the scenes. We've introduced a new CRM system in order to manage information flow better, and we've made lots of changes to our website, such as a library hub, including much-needed FAQ for authors and readers. In terms of licensing and sales, it's important to be clear from the start what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable, to anticipate common queries and pre-prepare answers in those FAQs. Although it's obvious, signing one agreement for many institutions, such as through JISC, saves us lots of time. And we've also heard from some consortia that they'd like to know that their institutes want to buy in before they're approached with a consortia offer. We're finding that reporting to librarians continues to be a challenge and very manual. And we've been working very hard on transparent metrics. So we want to produce comparative metrics for open access versus non-open access articles in usage, citations, and altmetrics. And we're actually working on those with Coalition S at the moment. So in summary, we've got transformative journals, which mean that we're compliant with funder mandates. We've got read and publish agreements, which are producing happy librarians and very happy authors. We feel that this transformative strategy aligns with our mission to support biologists, and it also secures a baseline income for quality publishing for the coming years. But there are definitely challenges as well. You'll hear from all the parties, lots of time-consuming manual work, which has increased our costs, and that it can be hard to gain attention when you're a small not-for-profit organisation. So I'd like to finish really by saying thank you to those librarians who put aside time as well as money to help us with our initiative. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Claire. Let me invite all of our panelists to switch on their cameras and their microphones or their speakers. Thank you. We've already had one comment from a participant in the audience, but let me encourage all of you, if you'd like to ask questions or give your perspective, which may be very different from those you've heard already today, please use the chat box to do that. The comment we've already had, David, this is directed at you. A member of the audience says, I 100% agree with David's summary, and I 300% agree on the evils that are article caps. So let's start there. Article caps are clearly a huge challenge. And in our research, we were struck by the fact that smaller independent publishers were far more likely to be presenting open access agreements that were uncapped, and larger publishers were far more likely to present open access agreements that were tied price-wise to the volume of articles published and that often included caps. So there's some opportunities of working with smaller publishers. David, Colleen, are there any other features besides article caps that your members particularly struggle with or find difficult?
Colleen, would you like to start, or I can jump in?
Go ahead. If you've got a thought already, go for it.
There are some publishers who have a wide array of article types, and sometimes knowing what the article type is a difficult thing. I sort of briefly mentioned it, but a lot of agreements will talk about applicable articles, and it's not entirely clear what the applicable articles are. So there's been a lot of confusion. I'm thinking of one particular publisher, particularly a large publisher, where they seem to have about 50 different article types as far as we can tell, and it's not entirely sure of that 50 how many of those are covered in the agreement. And it's one of those situations where you have to keep going back to the publisher and saying, oh, this is an invited research article. Does that count? Should that be included? So clarity around what exactly is included in the article types is an important one. And so the greater, I think, clarity always in terms of definitions is important. And the greater the clarity there is in definitions at the beginning, the easier it is for everybody to know exactly what is and is not included in the deals.
Right. Yeah, maybe I can jump on that. It doesn't really address, what it is in the agreement that is, desired or not desired, but it speaks to David's comment, and that is the need for standardization around metadata that is truly underlying all of this. And I know that among the recommendations presented in the report there are comments about, well, because society publishers are having to adapt, and that's a big ask for them to prepare their own systems in terms of being able to provide metadata, et cetera. I think that the sooner and the faster we can get to good metadata standards, and the better off the entire community will be. So yeah, that's something, getting agreement from the start and understanding, yes, this is what the publishing output of our institution looked like with respect to the publisher, and getting a common understanding, yes, that matches, right? That is a huge process at the start of negotiations. And if we all make improvements on understanding and providing the data that matches, then that's going to take a huge lift off of all of our shoulders.
Thank you for that. And there's another comment from the audience. It says, one unfortunate effect of the read and publish agreements with big publishers is that they effectively outsource their administration to us. We should start billing them for our time. We could call it the article administration cost, or AAC, which I love. So David and Colleen, your comments about complexity are clearly resonating with participants today. Claire, let's go back to capped or uncapped agreements for just a second. For a publisher, what's the driver for having a capped or uncapped agreement? How is it that smaller publishers can offer uncapped agreements?
I think that's a really interesting one, and I think that it's maybe to do with whether you're thinking more as a business or more as a community service. I think that from a business point of view, I can understand that a publisher looks at the price that they've agreed through a read and publish agreement, and it's based on the original read portion of the subscription and the published portion of the APCs. And I guess they think if they double the number of open access articles, they're essentially giving something away for nothing. They're losing the value of those articles. But as small not-for-profit publishers that are really close to the communities that publish with us, it's just the right thing to do. And I think we hear the stories. Authors often talk about I think there's a department pot somewhere that might pay for APCs, but I don't know how to apply to it. And there's a rumour that it's already run out. And they certainly don't want this new arrangement where they submit to a journal because they know it's got an agreement in place. They know it's compliant. It ticks all of the boxes for them. And then later in the year, when that article's being published, they discover that the pot's run out. That's just not right for the authors. That's just not what they want. And I think it's just that we wanted to do the right thing, slightly less business head perhaps, but I think definitely the right thing to do.
Thank you for that, Claire. That's really thought-provoking. We have another comment from a participant. The problem we are facing in my institution is that we as librarians are responsible for the read budget, but not for the publish budget. With the big deals, it was possible to have a transition without too much extra costs, but at this moment, we feel a bit stuck, struggling how to move forward from here without access to that publish budget. We are not the ones to decide on publishing. That's for the researchers to decide. So can you, panelists, please reflect on this? How can a library grapple with this problem? Colleen, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, sure. That I think we all feel that pain that was described in this comment, and I think that gets back to what the theme that I mentioned at the start, and that is alignment. This is a system change, and it will take conversations between multiple stakeholders within an institution to get to a point where, or even outside the institution, even the funding community, right? I know that in some discussions of transformative agreements, the conversation is having to be elevated all the way to the ministry level, because the point is we have the different funding streams that are present in scholarly publishing, and we need to change the flows for all of them, and so I think it's a challenge, but it's going to take bringing multiple stakeholders together. So whether that is finding a champion among the researchers, or to get the attention of the VC for research, or whomever that stakeholder might be in the institution. But yeah, there are best practices out there, or best practices, information shared on good practice through the networks of OA 2020. I know. So go look at OA 2020, or the US OA 2020 working group as well have dedicated a lot of efforts on suggestions on how to bring stakeholders together to have a conversation for establishing the OA funds that are necessary for this kind of agreement. Because this, if I might just add, this isn't only a question of transitioning scholarly societies, but it's also fully open access publishers, right? That's, who are also have to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Colleen. David, would you like to add anything to that?
Just to say that I think in the UK we've been relatively lucky in that the research-intensive universities have received centralised block grants from our main funder, our main research funder, and that has allowed us to enter into some of these agreements more easily. There's a question, as there is always a question with any grants, as to their long-term sustainability and whether in 5-10 years they will still be available. And we're currently waiting for a new open access policy from our main funder, UKRI. So it makes life easier if you have a centralized fund that you can aggregate together with the subscription funds and then use that as a total pot of money to pay to go into the negotiations for transformative deals. But we are still very much aware of the number of APCs that are, to use the phrase that's used widely, sort of in the wild, that people, there is no central record of, just the individual author has found some money within their grant, within their own grant, that they're able to pay APCs, and it's very difficult to match that up to then some of these centralized agreements.
And I would add 4 practical recommendations from the report to libraries who don't currently influence the published budget. The first is that a message that resonated with funders during our project is that they might believe that it's important to channel open access money to individual researchers in order to make them cost conscious. But all of the evidence to date is that researchers are not cost sensitive about where they publish open access. So if those funders want to drive open access, but do it in a way that is cost effective for the public purse, their best allies are to channel their open access money through libraries. So that's the first important message for getting the attention of funders. And then you might need to suggest some practical ways forward. In the UK, funders like Wellcome Trust and UKRI give block grants to a university, so the university itself is accountable for the open access publishing of all grant recipients on campus, and the libraries manage that on behalf of the university. So that's one way forward, but there are countries where that's not permitted for a funding body to do. So they might instead think about ring fencing a percentage of their total grants and giving those to universities to administer for open access publishing. And even if your funder can't do something like this, there are steps that you can take as a library to sensitize your university leadership. Your finance director can help track all of the open access money on campus, perhaps creating a code so you can assemble and more readily aggregate that money together. And there are models, this has been mentioned in the chat, the California Digital Library, for example, looking at co-payments between the library and researchers who have grants. That's a great way forward too. I just sound a slight note of caution to administer that approach in a way that's workable for small publishers, because it's a lot of infrastructure to manage both a central agreement with a library or a consortium and all of those individual payments. That can be really overwhelming for a tiny publisher. So some suggestions there. I hope you find that helpful. Let me look through here. Colleen, you talked about the commitment between stakeholders. What kinds of activities do you plan to help smaller publishers transform?
Okay. Well, I mentioned before the ESAC initiative, and so OA 2020 is, the international effort to drive a transition of today's scholarly journals to open access. The ESAC initiative is, in a way, kind of a sister entity, and it's basically a community of practice of libraries and consortia around the world implementing these agreements. And the ESAC initiative has done some work recently to I guess to sort of look at the landscape and at all of the phases of transformative agreements, right? From pre-negotiation to negotiation, implementation, assessment afterwards, and created come up with a bit of a map to sort of orient the community on the different resources, standards, guidelines that are there to help everyone in this process. And one small piece of that work is looking at the data and workflow standards that we think are useful. And as we roll that out, I think we want to, of course, engage with scholarly societies in those conversations. Okay, what is absolutely necessary right now, and what is it can we put on a wish list for further development as we go forward. So that's just one. And I think ultimately, as we get more and more practice in this, and more institutions and publishers engaged in this kind of agreement, sure, it will make sense at some point to bring in entities like NISO, right, to make this even bring it to a level of standardization. I think that it might be early for that yet, right? We're still in the process of working through what is useful and what the community really needs. But I think through ESAC, we have all kinds of opportunities to engage.
Thank you for that, Colleen. Claire, a couple of questions for you. First off, from your perspective, let's take the same discussion topic. If you had the ability to make 2 or 3 changes that would make it easier for you to implement one of these agreements, what would those changes be? What would you most like help from libraries and consortia?
So I think they're going to be very similar themes. I think we would love one agreement that works across lots of different libraries, so that we didn't have to negotiate lots of different agreements, or at least some models, so there might be, I'm going to say 3 to 5 different models, but we know what they are and we've explored them and we understand them. I think so. I think that's the biggest one. I think it's the really hard one is the getting the time, the attention from librarians. And I think, as David mentioned, we do need to keep it simple. And so we have gone for this simple addendum to the existing contract, which, even then, I love David's comments about, lists of articles and things like that are actually, they're more difficult because if someone looks at a list of articles, they think, well, I need to now understand which articles are included and which articles are not included. So I think simple agreements that allow us to get time with librarians, because they have to make a huge number of decisions about their purchasing in the year, and we want to be one of their selections, and that needs some time from them. And so obviously we want to make that as easy as possible, but we also need a way of knowing that we are going to get some time. And so I think support from organisations like ALPS, for example, in the case of the UK, the support from JISC has been incredible. That has really helped push those sorts of agreements through. So I think those would be the two main points, I think, from me. And also, the clear problem as well that hasn't come up yet today is VAT, which obviously needs some resolution.
So let's come back to VAT. But first, let me just summarize what I think I'm hearing from you both, Colleen and Claire. It sounded like some shared agreement around a model license or 2 or 3, some manageable number, some shared data templates, and some shared simple workflows would be helpful for both libraries and publishers. Okay, that's absolutely brilliant. And how to build consensus around that small number of model agreements will clearly be a challenge. We heard again and again in our research, well, there's a need for simplicity and consistency. So if everybody else will use my model license, everything will be fine. So there's got to be some give and some compromise. So that might be a ball to take up in the library community. How do you come up with some consensus? A challenge that was with the society publishers is whether you could do joint sales. Claire, can you talk a little bit about that model while I go answer my door? I'll be right back.
Yeah, so I think that people have worked really well together over the past couple of years. I think through the Smart Ops with funders and librarians, but also publishers working together. So, for example, I was one of the founding members of the Society Publishers Coalition, and that has been a really safe space for small not-for-profits to explore what they're trying to achieve and how to achieve it. And so the Society Publishers Coalition has definitely been a real help here. And I think that, we talked before about ALPSP has also put a lot of resource into being able to understand the different policies that are coming out and how they impact on us. So yes, I think that there's definitely room, Alicia, for publishers working together to look for shared objectives and consistency.
Thank you for that, Claire. Now we have another question. This is a good one from a participant. Do you believe that read and publish deals are still useful? Personally, I feel that the read part is effectively worthless at this point. Why not insist on publish deals only? That way, hybrid journals would be less lucrative and make their transformation to OA journals more appealing for the publishers. Would anyone like to comment on this?
I think this is a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, what we've tried to do is listen to our authors. And at the moment, the majority of authors are not publishing open access. That isn't because they don't want to, but it may be because they don't have the funds, their funder hasn't mandated it, their funder hasn't provided the financial support for it. And so if the majority of your authors do not currently want to choose open access, then it's not just the financial model that's actually holding a journal back. It has to listen to its authors and think about what they want. And we've had a history of, David talked about additional charges. The Company of Biologists has never charged for publishing. We don't have page charges or colour charges. Publishing with us has always been completely free. And so even the introduction of an APC and creating a financial relationship with an author, which has always before been a very pure relationship, even that was a challenge for us. And so I think that, I do think that these things will change with time. We have the subscribe to open agreements as well. Maybe as the proportion of read in agreements, the proportion of publish in agreements changes, we'll move towards, subscribe to open type models. So I think they will continue to change. But I don't think that journals are only thinking about the finances. I think they're also thinking about the author base and the funders for those authors.
Thank you, Claire. Colleen, David, would you like to address that point?
I could just add a couple of things, and then David might hear as well. Right. I mean, we have to think about this. There are different facets that we need to bring into this discussion of just moving directly to a publish-only agreement. First of all, in the context of library consortia, which in Europe, that they're primarily national level library consortia, and we have to remember we are coming from a very imperfect system, the system of subscriptions, where the costs were distributed in a particular way. And if we move to costs being associated with open access publishing, that might look very different. And so going from where, well, even in the context of one given country, there might be 5 subscribers to journals of Claire's journals, but none of the subscribers actually publish in that journal. The authors are in completely different institutions. And so having a transformative or transitional agreement is a way to smooth that transition. And it's not as drastic, because otherwise it's drastic, and it's unsustainable for the society. It puts at risk the society, but it's also unsustainable for the national consortium, because perhaps those institutions haven't prepared for supporting their authors yet, right? So I think that this is a transition, it's a process, and we need to work through it, I think is what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd want to dig a little bit deeper into what the questioner was meaning by the read aspect being worthless now. I mean, exactly. I mean, the UK has 160 universities. A small, I don't know what, about maybe 40% of those would consider themselves research intensive, and that's probably where the vast majority of authors for the papers are going to come from. The other ones are pretty much read only in terms of their relationship with journals. So for those institutions, they are very interested in the read side of the read and publish. So yeah, it's not clear to me that it is quite as valueless as perhaps the questioner was suggesting. But I'd love to understand more about where they were coming from on that. But yeah, we do have to think about those institutions as well, and make this process as smooth as we can for everybody involved.
That's right. I'm also thinking about this in the longer term. Even when all content is open access, there is value in that content, not only for the authors, but for readers in the future. And libraries are providing value to those readers in a variety of ways. For example, you're facilitating the long-term preservation and access to that content. So why not recognize that readers will receive value and factor that into the funding models by enabling read-intensive institutions to participate? In fact, I think that's pretty crucial. Something we heard again and again from Consortia is that if in an open access publishing world, all of the costs fall to the shoulders of research-intensive universities, the consortium will collapse, because those shoulders are already carrying a heavy weight and they can't necessarily afford to carry more. We all have a role to play. We all have funding and other resources to provide to make open access a reality and sustainable in the long term. Right, do please keep your comments and questions coming. This is really helping us have a lively conversation. Let me think of another one. What happens at renewal time for uncapped agreements? Does anybody know? Has anybody figured that out yet? Claire, have you figured it out?
That is such a good question. I think that's the hot potato right at this very moment, because we're obviously about to start on our agreements for next year. Some of them will be renewals and some of them are new agreements. And, I think it's as a public, we were just talking now about the business head, talking about whether you should have capped or uncapped agreements. And I think a similar thing comes into play here. If the number of articles being published has gone up, then a publisher would look at that and think, I'd like to put the price up. But of course, the librarian's not going to want them to put the price up. So I think it's making sure that you come up with a mutually agreeable option, and that could be about multi-year arrangements where there's consistency across several years for both parties. And I think that that's probably a good way forward.
Can I ask Claire a question? Claire, have you seen any increase in submissions from the countries where you have got now to read and publish agreements?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, David. So I know that that's one of the suggestions that think tanks have come up with, is that we'll get a lot more submissions. I don't believe that we are. I mean, I know it's early days for our agreements, but I don't think so. And I also accept that it's a difficult time because we have seen changes to our patterns of submissions because of the pandemic. So it's slightly harder for us to judge. But if you forced me to give an answer, I would say no.
Interesting.
I would agree. That's our experience as well at the Max Planck Digital Library. I mean, we've been negotiating agreements for years, and it's not influenced. I mean, this is precisely the point of transformative agreements or publishing agreements for open access. It's actually to step back and keep the authors, just let them submit where they want to submit. And our job as libraries is to give them the greatest number of open access publishing opportunities possible.
Where my question came from is that there is a large publisher in the UK where we have seen a significant increase, and I can't sit here and tell you what cause and effect is, but it is interesting that there was a really massive increase in the amount of papers that have been submitted to that publisher.
Right.
I hope your agreement is not tied to article volume too closely, because that would presumably be a huge challenge.
There's a cap, and that's why we don't like caps, because all of a sudden in September you have to start saying to authors, oh, I know we told you 3 months ago that this was a fabulous deal and you could publish open access. Well, now you can't. And it's just it's a completely unacceptable situation in terms of the relationship with the academic community, and from a purely sort of selfish point of view, it's for the libraries, it's really unacceptable, because often it's the library who gets blamed. It's you've stopped me from publishing open access now. So it's not. So that was a significant problem.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left, but there is another question from a participant. I'm guessing maybe a library press or a library publisher. It says, every publishing material does some cost. It has some cost. Then who will bear the expenses of running a not-for-profit publishing entity? What are all of the business models that are available for not-for-profit publishers? Claire, do you want to tackle that? And from the perspective of a tiny, maybe library-based publishing initiative.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I completely understand the gist of the question, but I would say that there are definitely some things buzzing in my head that I don't know the answer to yet. And one of those is the role of review type articles. So, we know that we believe that research articles should be open access and they should be included in these read and publish agreements uncapped. But what about review type articles? Those are the sorts of things where the in-house team actually put quite a lot of effort in. They commission them, they work to polish them. We redraw the figures. We do an awful lot of work on those. And there's certainly been hints from Coalition S that a future model that could be retained in a read portion, because they're very important article types and they cost us a lot of money, and we wouldn't want to see them disappear. So that's not really an answer to your question, but it's sort of something that I'm mulling as that sort of role of effort put into articles and how it might relate to these agreements.
Thank you for that, Claire. David, Colleen, any insight on how very small not-for-profit publishing, perhaps in a library, could be funded? It's often grant funded, or is it often covered just by the institution?
Sometimes it is grant funded, yes, and I don't see any problem with that. That's great. I mean, when people talk about the sustainability of say new university presses, they tend to think of them in traditional view of what a university press is, or what even a not-for-profit press is. No one ever talks about the sustainability of libraries. Libraries are assumed to get grants from the central university because they are providing a hugely valuable service. I don't see why. So for some universities who can afford it, if they think that the in-house press is providing a service, why can't they subsidise it? That's that, and if they continue to subsidise it, then that is in of itself a sustainable model.
That's brilliant. Absolutely. Colleen, final word. Oh, I think we're almost out of time. So
out of time. Okay, no, go ahead. The only thing I wanted to say was I think this is the key here. There isn't one silver bullet. There isn't one open access strategy. I think if we want a diverse open information environment, we have to have multiple strategies. And so, yes, the library press has one, and society publishers, but also the large commercial publishers. It has to be a comprehensive strategy.
Absolutely brilliant note to end on. Thank you all participants for your comments and questions, and our terrific panelists, David, Colleen, and Claire. Thank you all very much, and talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Alicia and the panelists.